The lens we are looking at today is the 50mm f1.8 autofocus lens from Meike. We have reviewed some of the Meike L-mount lenses on this channel previously, but they were all manual focus lenses. This lens is Meike's first autofocus L-mount lens. Since Meike is not part of the official L-mount alliance, which makes this lens very interesting, as so far no other company outside the official alliance has created any autofocus lenses for L-mount. So this is the first ever third-party autofocus L-mount lens. I say first ever third-party autofocus L-mount lens because lenses from all the other L-mount alliance members like Leica, Lumix, Sigma, and Samyang are all considered as first party. Apart from this 50mm f1.8, Meike is also releasing two other autofocus L-mount lenses, the 85mm f1.4 and 85mm f1.8. I'm also working on the review of the Meike 85mm f1.4 L-mount lens, but today we will just focus on this 50mm f1.8 lens. The price of this lens is just $170, so it's the cheapest autofocus L-mount lens in the market right now, and it's also much cheaper than any other L-mount 50mm autofocus lens, including the very popular Lumix S 50mm f1.8, which has a normal retail price of around $450, even though you could quite often get it a little bit cheaper than that. But no matter what, this Meike is still significantly cheaper than the Lumix. So in this review, we'll do some comparison between the Meike and the Lumix and see if it is a good idea to buy this budget 50mm f1.8 lens or not. Before we start, I want to tell you the lens sample I used in this review was sent to me by Meike. I do not need to return the lens after the review, but I also did not receive any money from Meike for this review. As I've mentioned at the beginning, this is the first L-mount autofocus lens from Meike. If you are a regular viewer of this channel, you may remember I have reviewed the Meike 50mm f1.8 for Nikon Z just a few months ago. This L-mount version is pretty much the same lens, but with a different mount. Meike told me this lens is part of their SE series, which stands for Standard Edition. The SE series include the 50mm f1.8, 85mm f1.8, and 35mm f2. This series focuses on balancing the cost and performance. In other words, these lenses may not give you the absolute best performance or build quality, but the price is attractive. As I've mentioned at the beginning, this lens is only $170. Meike also has the Mix series, which is their high-end lenses. It includes the 85mm f1.4, which I'm testing right now. So remember to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, so you won't miss that review. When you pick up the lens, you will immediately notice it is a budget lens because of its very plastic construction, but it still comes with a reversible lens hood and it has a metal lens mount with a USB-C port on it for firmware update. The size of the lens is not exactly small. If I put it next to the Lumix S51.8, it is slightly taller, even though it's not a huge difference. There is a AF/MF switch on the lens. The switch feels alright, and then we have the manual focus ring. That's all the controls we have on the lens. The weight of this lens is a little bit under 400 grams. It feels quite alright when I mount it on the S5 II, but it does feel and look a little bit long when I mount it on the S9. I do really like to see some more compact autofocus lenses for L-mount users in the future. So Meike, if you are watching this video, can you please consider creating some autofocus pancake lenses in the future? This lens has a bright red rubber seal on the metal lens mount. Interestingly, when I asked Meike if this is a weatherproof lens, they told me it is not. The front filter thread is 58mm. While the lens certainly feels very plasticky, the actual build quality is alright. The only thing I don't like is that every time when I remove the lens hood, there is some noise that makes me feel I have snapped something from the lens hood. I think I've made the same comment when I did the Z-mount review, but it is exactly the same with this L-mount version. As this is the first ever third-party autofocus L-mount lens, autofocus is the thing that I'm most curious and also worried about this lens. After all, I've tested the Z-mount version, so I am expecting the image quality and other area of this L-mount version will be very similar, if not identical to the Z-mount version. So it's the autofocus that is completely unknown. So I have some good news and bad news to share with you. Let's start with the good news first. The autofocus is pretty quiet and smooth when I take photos. Accuracy and speed are both very good. I also didn't notice any problem when I shoot using face or eye detection. I've used this lens to shoot a range of different photos under different lighting conditions, and overall it works really well. When I shoot videos, it is also mostly good news. It follows me quite well when I did my usual autofocus test using human detection. It follows me quite quickly and smoothly. I don't think there is a huge difference when I compare it with the Lumix lens test on the S5 II. Now the bad news is, when I was doing the focus briefing test, when I put the autofocus target quite close to the edge of the frame, the camera would struggle quite a bit to focus on the target. And I have repeated quite a few times and also moved the camera around a little bit, and the result was pretty much the same. It would either hunch a bit or just would not shift the focus and wait for quite a while and then it would focus. And then I swapped to the Lumix lens and all the problem disappear. So that means the problem comes from the lens itself and not the camera. So is this actually a problem? I guess it depends on what and how you shoot. I've shot many different real-world videos using this lens over the last few weeks, and I actually didn't notice this problem at all. It's only when I did the focus briefing test with single area autofocus near the edge, then I noticed this issue. So it may not be a problem at all if you use this lens to just shoot some normal video where your subject is always close to the center of the frame. Let's look at the image sharpness next. And if we zoom in to the center of the photo, at f1.8, the Meike is very sharp. And surprisingly, it is actually sharper than the Lumix at f1.8. I really was a bit surprised by that. Stopping down to f2.8, now Lumix also becomes very sharp, and there isn't much difference between these two lenses in terms of center sharpness. If we continue to stop down the lens, both lenses continue to deliver excellent center sharpness, and there isn't any noticeable difference between these two lenses until we reach around f11, then diffraction starting to soften up the image a bit. I want to mention that the Lumix can go all the way to f22, but Meike can only stop down to f16. And let's have a look at the corner sharpness now. At f1.8, Meike's corner is quite soft, it's a bit smudgy. The Lumix is much better. But if I refocus the photo at the corner, then Meike's corner is a lot better, almost the same as the Lumix. But when I do that, the center of the Meike is not sharp anymore. This suggests the Meike has a bit of field curvature. So if you want good corner sharpness, definitely focus at the corner, but just be aware the center won't be that sharp anymore. With the Lumix lens, focus at the corner doesn't make any noticeable difference to the center or corner sharpness of that lens. One interesting thing is, when I reviewed the Z-mount version of this Meike lens, I didn't notice the lens field curvature at all, but this time I noticed it very clearly with this L-mount version. I don't believe there's any optical difference between these two versions. The only difference is I did the Z-mount version sharpness test not using my usual test chart, and I also didn't do it in my usual testing location. Maybe that's the reason why I didn't notice the field curvature. If we continue the test with the focus is at the center point, once we stop down the lens further, Meike's corner sharpness is getting better and better, and actually would become slightly better than the Lumix lens once we stop down a little bit more. Okay, now we'll have a look at the close-up shooting performance. The minimum focus distance of the Meike lens is 63 cm, which is not that close for a 50mm lens. I don't have the official maximum magnification ratio figure, but from my calculation, it is around 0.1 time, which is alright, but I definitely wish it is a little bit higher. In comparison, Lumix maximum magnification is at 0.15 time, which is quite a bit higher. Sharpness at the minimum focus distance is not bad with the Meike. It's sharp enough, but you can improve the sharpness and contrast a bit by stopping down the lens. These are two photos that I shot with the camera on the tripod at the same position. The scene was just completely lit up by my studio light at 5500K, and the white balance setting on my camera is also set at 5500K. I noticed two major differences between these two photos. First, the field of view is quite a bit tighter with the Meike, and second, the Meike's color is a bit warmer than the Lumix. If I try to adjust the white balance setting to match the two photos, I need to make the Meike about 400K cooler to get the similar color temperature. Bokeh is quite important for a fast 50mm lens. I'm happy to report that this budget Meike lens performs pretty well in this area as well. Bokeh is nice and smooth. There isn't much cat's eye effect or nervous halo ring. Look at this comparison with the Lumix. Meike's bokeh actually looks a little bit smoother as well. And if you look at the edge of the photo, the bokeh from the Meike is a little bit more round than the Lumix. So it seems overall the bokeh from the Meike is a little bit more round and smooth than the Lumix. With vignetting correction enabled, both lenses have some minor vignetting at f1.8, but vignetting pretty much disappears once we stop down to f2.8. And if I disable vignetting correction, at f1.8, I see more noticeable vignetting. This is for both lenses. Stopping down to f2.8 would reduce vignetting quite a bit, but I have to stop down to f5.6, then vignetting becomes almost not noticeable. This Meike lens chromatic aberration control is quite decent. While there can still be a bit of color fringing in some of the high contrast photo, the amount of color fringing is not crazy at all. And if I just look at these photos full screen, there really isn't any very noticeable color fringing at all. And let's have a look at these local test photos. Meike's performance is also not bad. Comparing the Meike with the Lumix, the Meike has a bit more color fringing in the foreground, while the Lumix has a bit more color fringing in the background, so overall they are quite similar. When I process the raw files in Lightroom, with the lens profile correction enabled, the Meike has a small amount of pincushion distortion, while the Lumix is almost perfect. One thing very interesting is, if I disable lens profile correction in Lightroom, I actually get less distortion. So in other words, the lens profile correction actually increases the amount of distortion to the Meike. So I'm wondering maybe there is something wrong with the lens profile for the Meike lens. When I did the Meike 50mm f1.8 Z-mount review, I was quite impressed by that lens flare performance. By that, I don't mean the lens has amazing, flawless lens flare control. It's just usually lens flare is the biggest weakness for lenses from Chinese optics companies, especially the really budget lenses like the Meike 50 f1.8. So I was really expecting to see the worst, but the result was far from that. It's very acceptable even when I shoot directly into the sun. So this time I did some comparison with the Lumix and the result from the Meike is pretty decent. Now, the Lumix is definitely better with better contrast and a little bit less lens flare, but that's not unexpected as I always impressed by Lumix lens flare performance. But look at the side-by-side comparison, Meike's lens flare performance is really not bad at all. We'll have a look at Sunstars now. With the Meike lens, we need to stop down the lens to around f8, then we start to get some Sunstars in the photo. With the Lumix, I need to stop down a little bit more to around f11 to get similar Sunstars. At f16, the Sunstars from the Meike is slightly sharper than the Lumix, however, the tails are a bit uneven. The Lumix can stop down one more stop to f22 to get longer and sharper Sunstar tails, while Meike's minimum aperture is only f16. This Meike lens has quite a bit of focus breathing, which to be honest I'm not that surprised. When I did my usual 1 meter to 20 meter focus breathing test, I see some pretty noticeable focus breathing from the Meike. While the Lumix also has a bit of focus breathing, it is quite a bit better than the Meike. If you want to do manual focus, the focus ring direction turns in the opposite direction to the usual L-mount lenses. So this is something you need to consider as you may be a bit confused when you are switching between different lenses. And while I can still choose between linear and non-linear manual focus setting on my Lumix S5 II, and I can also choose the degree in linear mode, it doesn't seem like Meike has implemented any of these settings, as none of these settings seems to affect the actual manual focus operation. After all these comparisons, I think it's fair to say Meike's performance is really not bad at all. Image quality is decent in most areas, very good sharpness, nice bokeh, good chromatic aberration control, even lens flare, which is usually the biggest weakness for a lot of Chinese lenses, is not too bad. I wish the minimum focus distance can be a little bit closer, but to be fair, 0.1 time magnification is not terrible. For example, the Realtrox 50mm f1.8 for the E and Z mount also has the same maximum magnification ratio. Build quality is very plasticky and surely feels cheap. But it is a cheap lens, so I guess you get what you pay for. In terms of autofocus, it is a mixed bag. Under most everyday shooting conditions, autofocus performs quite well and is reasonably fast and quiet. However, if you move the autofocus point to near the edge of the frame, then the autofocus performance would drop significantly. If you like to manual focus, it can also be a bit of a problem because the focus ring turns in opposite direction compared to the usual L-mount lenses, and it seems Meike hasn't implemented support for all those manual focus control settings as well, at least not with the firmware that I'm testing right now. Overall, for a lens that is just around $170, while it's no way a perfect lens, it's also very hard for me to complain about anything. If you are a L-mount shooter and want a 50mm lens but don't want to spend too much money, this is definitely worth considering. To me, I think what is even more important is, this is the beginning of third-party autofocus lens for L-mount users. We are going to see more affordable L-mount autofocus lenses from Meike like the 85 f1.4 that I'm testing right now, and possibly from other manufacturers in the future as well. So if you are a L-mount user, this is definitely an exciting time.